Hello, Dan Ring here, and in this video I'm going to show you how to get started with a new SmartPaint pre-release plugin. So let's start by diving into the node. And the first thing you'll see is that there's a guide section here. So this contains all of the steps that I'm going to go through now to show you how to get started with pushing paint throughout a shot. And the first thing we want to do is get some motion vectors. So the SmartPaint plugin relies on motion vectors to push paint throughout a shot. And we do this by connecting our UV input here to something that creates motion vectors, such as this vector generator plugin here. Now the vector generation is one of the most expensive things about this workflow. So if possible, if you can, I usually try and write out the motion vectors to a separate file and then read them back in and use a shuffle node to shuffle the motion vectors and RGB data together into the same channel. So I'm going to do that now and connect my UV input up to my shuffle node that I've created already. So once I've done that, I'm nearly ready to start pushing vectors. What I want to do now is set up my root file. So this is where all of the rendered data gets kept. So because I know I'm not going to be sharing my script with anybody, I know I'm just going to be using it locally on my own machine, I can create the warp data inside the temp folder. So I'm just going to call this temp and balloon there. The next thing you want to do is set up your first and last frames. So these are the frames over which all of the paint will be propagated by default. So 117 is the length of this clip, but for this example I'm actually just going to use 10 frames just to keep it simple. So to actually make the edits now, we need to add a keyframe. So if we add a keyframe here, you can see that the table now contains the current frame 0, our first and last frames taken from those knobs. And you can see that now that it's rendering the warp data. So this is using the motion vectors to figure out where everything on frame 0 goes to in frames 0 to 10. So once that's ready, I can now supply anything I want to on the edits input and have that pushed from anything on frame 0 in the edits input to frames 0 and 10. Now typically you want to use a RotoPaint node. So for this example, because we're going to focus on pushing paint, I'm going to create a RotoPaint node here. And the reason I've used this button to create the RotoPaint node is because the RotoPaint actually has to be created in a kind of a bit of a special way for this pre-release version. In the actual release, it'll be a lot simpler, but for this version, it's just easier to use that Create RotoPaint Node button to set up the RotoPaint in a way that will work for this plugin. So we're actually all ready to go. So now that the warp data has been rendered, we have our keyframes, we can actually start painting straight away. So I can paint a smiley face there. And if I now skip throughout the shot, you can see that between frames 0 and 10, that smiley face is now sticking. So that's exactly what we want. Now let's do something a bit more interesting, like doing some cloning. Now, as I said, the RotoPaint node has to be set up in a kind of a special way. And so for cloning, what you want to do is set your input to background. So unfortunately, if we actually go to the RotoPaint node here, you can see all of the RGB data has been replaced. So this means we can't clone from the foreground. We can only clone from the background. And then to actually view the output, you actually have to connect the viewer to the SmartPaint node like this. So if I'm in my clone brush now, and I want to paint out this balloon here, I know I'm on frame 0, so that's my keyframe, I can now start painting here. The important thing is that I've set my source for the clone to the background input here. So imagine I can just paint out some balloons here. And again now if I skip forwards, you can see that all of those balloons have been painted out and have been skipped forwards. Now, one of the nice things about this example, and I chose this particularly, is because there's a lot of grain and noise in the image. So you can see in the areas where the balloons were painted out that the areas have been cloned, but the noise hasn't been cloned. So you can see here particularly, it looks quite sort of flat. So if you're using this in production, what you probably want to do is use the alpha output from this and apply some sort of regrain pipeline to it. It's just something to be aware of. So this is the first example of pushing one keyframe. But let's see what happens if we want to extend this past frame 10. So to do that, what we'll do is we'll delete that existing keyframe. We'll go back to frame 0, and we'll change the frame range to frame 20. And then when we add a new keyframe, what should happen, we get a render aborted error. So that means something went wrong in the render. Unfortunately, sometimes you might get an error like that just because of, I'm actually not sure, there's just issues with Nuke and the background rendering. But if that happens, what you can do is click the render missing button or the re-render all if you want to re-render all of the frames that it needs. So that's what I'm going to do now. So now that the rendering is finished, I can now go to any frames between 0 and 20, and the edits will have been pushed out that far. So another reason why I chose this bit of footage is that the balloons that I was painting out, they actually move very slightly differently than the background. So you can see that the motion vectors now have sort of meant that the parts of the balloon have now been uncovered. So this is a perfect time to add a new keyframe. So what I can do now is on frame 20, I can add a new keyframe. But for this example, I know that I don't want to push that the entire length of the frame. So what I can do is set a window. And if I do that window, then I can push between -5 frames previous to the current frame and +5 frames past the current frame. So for this example, I know I just want to keep between 0 and 20. So I'm going to make that 0 because I don't want to push past 20. And what I'm going to do here is go back 10 frames. So what I can do now is add a keyframe. And once that's finished rendering, then I should be able to paint any more edits onto my new keyframe 20. And they'll now be pushed back between frames 10 and 20 here. So let me just show you how that works. So there's a clone there. And you can see now that's being pushed backwards. So the idea is that you can create as many keyframes as you want, and the order in which they're rendered is the exact same order as is shown in the table. So here, the keyframe at frame 0 will be rendered first, and frame 20 will be rendered over on top of it. So that now captures about 80 to 90% of how you use SmartPaint. The remaining interesting part of this workflow is the blend mode option, and I'm going to leave this as a homework exercise because it's easier to play with this yourself and to see how it works. But the tooltip also gives a lot of information how it's used. For this example, I left the blend mode off, so it's set to none, and what this means is that each keyframe will be rendered over all previous ones. But if I wanted to, I could set an option, say, for example, dissolve replace, which means that the two keyframes will sort of cross-dissolve between each other. So you can see between frames 0 and 20, that this balloon here is being cross-dissolved. There's another interesting dissolve windowed option, which lets you use the windowed frame range mode to basically give sort of a ramp that lasts the duration of the first and last keyframe and sort of blends in from the first, is maximum at your actual keyframe, and then fades out towards your last keyframe. So this is really useful if you find that you have to make lots of small changes to one particular part of the shot, and you don't want to have to render the entire render over the entire shot. So the last thing I want to talk about is sort of the limitations of this plugin. So at the moment, as I said, we have to create the RotoPaint node in a very special way. And as I showed you, that means that we end up having to replace the RGBA input, and we also have to set an output mask. So the way that the SmartPaint works is that anything with an RGBA will be blended using its alpha channel, but it also has a pre-mult operation inside it. And so this is sort of key to how we get nice blending within the SmartPaint node. But it does mean that at the moment, the RotoPaint node has to have this sort of quirky setup. Now, unfortunately, as I said, that means that you can't clone from the foreground, so you can't make iterative sort of changes to your clone region. So, say if I clone from there, and I want to then clone on top of that, then or use the results of that clone and clone somewhere else, that won't work. So at the moment, the workaround for that is actually to create a separate RotoPaint node and basically create your clean plate in here. So what I could do here is I could clone from here, and then I could use that result to clone there and clone here. And what I can do then is supply that as a new input to my specially created RotoPaint node. So I've set that up on BG1, and instead of using clone, what I can do is do a reveal, and I'll use the BG1 input to reveal. So if I go here, I can then reveal that part of the frame that I was painting, and you can see all those bits of sort of recursive clone operations that I did have now been pulled through. And if I go through the shot now, they'll now be pushed through. So it's a bit of a workaround. For the actual release version, you won't have to do this, but this is just for the pre-release version. So I think that covers most of what I wanted to talk about. If there's any questions or anything, feel free to get in touch. I hope you enjoy it. Thanks.